Well, welcome. I hope everyone had a really good holiday weekend and spent some time with family and was able to just sort of, chill out for maybe a few days. And now I guess we're all back at it, right? Ready, trying to gear up for yet the next one. So just a few pieces of housekeeping before we get started. So we are going to record this, as you heard, and we will send out the recording and the presentation after the event, as we always do. And there will be a couple of anonymous polls as we go through this. And so there will actually be two. If you could just go ahead and answer those questions, I appreciate it. And then we'll, put your answers up. And you can also put your questions in chat if you would like, or you can raise your hand, and we're going to get to those towards the end. So I just want to welcome you guys on behalf of both Cindy and John and I to this presentation. So Ben Waber is the president and co-founder of Humanyze. He has a Ph.D. from MIT, and he's also spent some time working as a senior researcher at the Harvard Business School. And a lot of his work centers around real-time data flows to rethink the management of people, physical architecture, corporate planning, and training, among other things. And he has been featured in all kinds of major media outlets such as Wired, The Economist, and NPR. He actually has a book called People-Analytics. So he literally has written the book on that. Today, he's going to be talking about shaping a data-driven, people-centric future of work based on the research that he has been featured in their fall 2021, so very current Future of Work report. So a big thank you to Ben and Humanyze for sharing their research with us today. And if you want to learn more about Humanyze, Ben's going to be presenting their solution on December the 14th. To this group and anyone who wants to join. So more about that later. But right now I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Ben, thank you appreciate you being here today.
All right, no, thanks for that kind intro. And hopefully
if everyone could mute, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no, we'll see. Well, my dog might appreciate the having some partnership from the remote folks, but yeah, it might be good for folks to mute. So, yeah, I mean, it was, right there was a little bit of an intro of some of the things that I think about, but really going back to, to my PhD research as well as what we do at the company, it's just always been fascinating to me that you can go to pretty much any organization in the world and ask really simple questions about what goes on internally that people just can't answer, right? Like, how much does the management team talk to the product team? No one knows. Even how many hours people work, right? And you think about how simple those questions are, but also how critical they are. And the reason that people can't answer them is that they don't have data, right? Now we might use surveys, we might use human observers, and that data is very useful. We're going to get into that, but at the same time, it's limited, right? That there's actually so much data that we already have about how work happens. We have things like Zoom, we have email, we have chat. And the metadata from these systems tells us an awful lot about how work is actually happening. And that is particularly interesting because if you think about the people side of business, really comparing it to every other aspect of the engineering.
Followed by pound.
There we go. We probably should see if we can mute. All right. So in any case, it's something where this, this data really gives us an unprecedented view on how work actually happens.
Followed by pound. Otherwise, just press
really important
pound.
About that is that it
you
lets
are
us.
In the meeting now. There are more than 30 participants in the meeting.
We'll see.
This meeting is
so
being
folks,
recorded.
Remember, you should probably mute your phones. But that's all right. It's this is just what we're all doing right now, so it's okay. So, and I think this is probably a good example of how COVID has changed how we work, right? We've worked in a remote environment for a while. And so when we go back to this data-driven view of how work happens, it's interesting because I think pre-pandemic, a lot of us pretended that we knew what we were doing from a people management perspective, right? We said, as executives or as leaders of companies, we would say, all right, I know that this new headquarters is going to improve how we collaborate. or I know that these new processes are going to make us, really efficient for this particular, hold on. I was actually wondering if one of the organizers could mute some of the some of the folks. I don't think I can do it on my end. But if you could mute, that would be helpful because it's a little bit distracting. Here we go. So now that we have this sort of, again, so just sort of getting back to what I was saying, given that work has changed so much during the pandemic, there's, again, this idea that even though pre-pandemic, we would pretend that we knew what we were doing, right? We knew that all these decisions we made were actually going to improve performance. If we're being honest, those were hypotheses, right? That it was a guess, essentially, and it could be an educated guess, that this new decision was going to improve how we work. But we treated those things as just like they are the right decision. And I think one of the things, beyond just working remotely, one of the things that COVID has really exposed is that these things really are hypotheses, right? If every organization was saying, hey, we're going to be back in to the office in September of 2021, and that didn't happen, right? And again, there's reasonable explanations for that, but it causes us to need to think differently about how we communicate things to employees about how we're making decisions, but also how we actually measure these things. How do we justify them, right? Why are we actually making certain decisions? Because even though it was probably not great practice pre-pandemic to just, say you're going to make a decision because that's what I think is the best way to do it without any justification, but that it really has changed perceptions, which is obviously extremely important. And so what we're trying to do here is sort of two parts to this discussion today. So in one part, what we've done is done a survey of knowledge workers and managers across the US to understand how they feel about sort of how they work, where they work, workplace strategy, these general people decisions that organizations are making. And then what we're going to do is look at the actual data of how folks work. So what we do at Humanyze is we hook into collaboration data that companies already have. Again, I mentioned these email, Zoom, chat, all these systems to look at these networks within organizations, how they change over time, how work happens from a quantitative perspective. And so then what we'll do after we go over these results is we'll look at, well, how does this compare to what we actually see changing in terms of how folks work? So at least for information workers, we do have a globally representative data set from millions and millions of people, which gets pretty interesting. But then really getting to some of the implications of both these changes in preferences as well as changes in patterns and how people collaborate. Because I think we see two things. We see very interesting opportunities in employee sentiment in terms of changing how we actually manage organizations. But also we've seen, I think, some positive things from remote work that at least I wouldn't have suspected, just based on the data that we see from these organizations. So again, here's just some information about the folks that we survey. But yeah, again, information workers. So there's obviously, the fact that 17% of folks who worked remotely pre-pandemic is, higher than the population, but for information workers is not that far off the average, right? So we certainly have, we certainly have a lot of folks there, a lot of data there. And again, I sort of mentioned what we have in terms of data at Humanyze. We have, tens of billions of workplace interactions. Again, what we do is we work with typically large, global Fortune 1000 companies to look at data on how folks collaborate, and we do this in an anonymous way. Again, as was mentioned earlier, we'll actually talk. I'm not going to talk today about what our product does or anything like that. If you're interested, of course, happy to talk about it, but more want to talk about the data that we have that offers insight into how just work is changing more globally. So there's a couple different classes of questions that we asked on the survey to try to understand, again, how people are feeling about work, about decision-making in organizations, and then really post-pandemic, what those preferences are. And again, what I want to emphasize here is I would never say that companies should just blindly follow what employee preferences are, because certainly frontline folks might not have a macro level view of what strategically an organization wants to change. At the same time, if you're going to make a certain decision, like let's say if you have people come into the office 5 days a week and you're going to lose 40% of your workforce, I don't care how much you think or even have data to show that would make folks more productive. Like that is probably a really bad idea. So again, taking this sentiment data in conjunction with other information, I think is important. And so I'm actually sort of curious what folks think. Actually, the more general, at least information worker population is going to answer here. So just want to do a first poll in terms of what do you think has been the top challenge for employees of the pandemic? And I have these 3 options here, so you can read them off and pick one. And I think that we should have the, oh, there we go. It's untitled poll. So, okay, we've got 2 questions here. So, and you can see them both here. And then there's, of course, the second question, which is, what do you think has been the top challenge for managers during the pandemic? And there's also 3 options here. So you can, so I'll give you all a second to just think about it. And again, just to be clear, like there obviously is a sort of right answer for these, but obviously a lot of these things were challenges for folks, right? All right, so assuming, let's see, can we look at the, let's see if we can look at the results. There we go, okay. So, interesting. So employee disengagement and attrition by far, at least on the second question, was the most, I say, popular answer, which is accurate, actually, at least for managers. And I think this was particularly interesting. Well, okay, it's not shocking because obviously there's been a lot of coverage in the press about the Great Resignation, which I have thoughts about how sort of wonder, in certain industries, my bet is from the data that I've seen that is very significant. But I will just point out, given historically low turnover in 2020, it's not unexpected that turnover in 2021 will be higher. So I do want to point that out. But yeah, this is obviously a really big concern for a lot of folks. At the same time, for employees, man, you folks actually got it right. Wisdom of the crowd's actually working out here, which is impressive. Absolutely correct that actually work-life balance was the top challenge. What's interesting about that, so we've actually done this survey multiple times during the pandemic, and in April, that number was 58%. So, we don't have obviously the definitive explanation for why work-life balance, while still the top concern, is becoming less of a concern. I think there's probably 2 things at play here. So one is that, now people for, well over a year and a half have been working in, this remote environment and have likely developed habits and patterns to be more effective in that scenario. And when we get into the hard data later, it is very interesting to look at changes in how people work in terms of quantitatively, when we look at things like email data, how does this relate to these changes in perceptions? But it's quite significant. So that's interesting. I mean, the other part, of course, is like there is somewhat more in-person work than there was previously. And so maybe having that actual separation has been more helpful. I think this is something that is not, maybe unexpected, but certainly the fact that when everybody is working in a remote environment, and I do want to stress that I think that is during the pandemic something that is extraordinary compared to pre-pandemic, when maybe a day a week or something you might work from your home. That just we've collapsed all the barriers between work life and home life, and it also has meant that because we were also in a pandemic, like my kids had remote school, right? And so actually it was harder for me to take a meeting at 2 p.m. during the day than it was at like 8 p.m. It was actually easier. That doesn't mean it was good, right? Like it was still like quite stressful because you can never like turn off, but it might have been necessary. And so maybe as some of these things get better, again, most kids back to school in person, that certainly has had an effect here. At the same time, as we go down the list, it's not to say there aren't other challenges. Obviously, there's been a number of challenges for folks. The inability to collaborate in person is called out here by employees as, but with both their teams as well as with folks outside their team has been really important. And again, I don't want to talk too much about what we see in the collaboration data, but this is something that is very much echoed when you look at how folks collaborate. That there certainly is, it's actually interesting that there is an awful lot of communication within teams, but it seems like it's harder and harder for folks to collaborate outside teams. And that, again, it's quite close to work-life balance as a top concern. So the idea of providing an office as or not even necessarily a corporate owned office, but even things like co-working spaces as a way for folks to collaborate in person is something that certainly looks pretty important to folks. Now again, on the manager side, sort of less productivity and efficiency is a concern. You can see 17%, so it's not super high. I mean, what you can see for managers at least is there's a much wider variance of concerns. And so it likely depends on the exact organization and how they've been managing the pandemic. And managing remote work, it appears that that's had more of an effect. But it is telling you that is the second highest concern. And I think, I don't know if folks saw back in August, I wrote a piece in HBR actually about the video game industry. And what was interesting about the video game industry, I don't know if any folks here are in the video game industry, or some folks might play video games. If you've noticed, so the video game industry has been on fire since the pandemic. I think their sales were up something like 50% as an industry in 2020 compared to 2019, which for an already fairly large industry is pretty significant. But then, of course, the reason for this is that people are stuck at home playing games, right? So maybe not shocking, but it's also interesting because so not only is that industry financially doing well, but also video games are things that by and large can be developed remotely. You're talking about there's just very little, physical work that needs to be done to make a game. And that's important because for other industries, you could point to things like supply chain disruptions or other issues as the cause of delays. Whereas in the video game industry, you can't point to any other things. And what has been happening over the past year and a half is really a historic number of delays have been announced by video game companies. It's really interesting. There's actually a Wikipedia article of the impact of COVID-19 on the video game industry, which if you ever like reading Wikipedia is quite entertaining. But basically what we wanted to do in this HBR piece was try to look quantitatively at this impact of particularly working from home on video game companies. And the idea here was that if remote work makes it harder to be productive, especially on large scale projects, sort of things like milestone attainment on things like video games, which are very complex pieces of software. What you would actually expect to see is companies announcing more delays and challenges with development when they move to remote work. And there are some Japanese companies and Korean video game companies that didn't actually move to remote work. And so we were able to actually compare these different firms, and essentially what you were able to show was that firms that moved to remote work were announcing 8 times the number of delays and development challenges as companies that were able to stay in person. Again, particularly some of the companies in Japan and Korea, until actually quite recently, were still in the office every day. Again, longer discussion about how to do that. But, and this gets to why I don't think it's surprising that this is a concern, because I would say that I don't believe this should represent that people aren't working. Right? People are actually working in terms of the number of hours during the day. It's roughly equivalent to pre-pandemic. I think that the question is, are we working on the right stuff? And I think that's where this is coming out. Going to the last line here, though, again, meeting in person with teammates and managers is important for employees as well. And you sort of see that mirrored on the manager side as well, communication with team and colleagues, right? So there are some similar concerns here, but obviously you already start to see some of a disconnect between frontline employees and managers. And again, that's important because as you're trying to develop a strategy, if folks have different concerns and you're not solving them in a way that sort of satisfies all parties, you're going to get a lot more issues, right? And it's not to say, again, you can satisfy everybody, but this is indicating that this is probably going to be more challenging than I think a lot of folks were initially planning. All right, so we'll go to the next poll. Again, we'll see. You folks did pretty well for the last one, so we'll see if we can do well on this one. So if you had to guess, what % of employees feel confident in their company's post-pandemic workplace strategy? So that's this first one. There's a couple options here. And then the Fourth poll was that what percent of companies do you think are actually using workplace data to inform post-pandemic decisions? And so as the polls brought up, for this question in particular, I just want to emphasize, a couple things here. So one is that it does seem like an awful lot of organizations are planning their long-term workplace strategy based on the perception of or preferences of a couple of executives, like if we're being honest, right? And maybe they're using surveys to figure out, again, like what decision can we make where like the fewest number of people will quit, right? But again, you would argue that the physical workplace, the office is a tool, right? To change how people collaborate. And I don't know if we can get the poll up. At least I can't see it.
Ben,
we'll see if we can do it.
Ben, for some reason, it's not coming up. So I'm trying.
All right. Well, so
get it
everyone
up,
can just
but
think of their answer. So we're going to be on the honor system here, and folks can
Yep.
think of their answer, and then you can compare it to what's actually here, right? But it's, again, and just one more thing to emphasize here, you would argue that the office or working remotely, all these things are tools to change how we collaborate. Like that's all they are, frankly, right? Well, that's not all they are. That is the majority of what they're designed to do, right? It's actually to change how people work, right? And so the question is, what are you trying to achieve? Either by having people work remotely, having them work in a co-working space, having them in office, like what are you trying to do? And ideally what you would do is actually use data to drive that, to be able to say, well, when people work remotely, we see more behaviors X, Y, and Z. We see these teams are working a lot more closely with each other or not as much. And that we are intentionally choosing to have people in the office in this way to try to change this behavior, right? And then there's a lot of issues that would not totally solve, but improve. Because here's what you'll see in their results, right? 63% of folks lack confidence in their company strategy, right? And this has gone up since April. Again, I mentioned we've done these surveys a couple of times. And so you can see a pretty significant increase. And this is really concerning for me because, again, it points to the fact that most organizations are being very declarative about their sort of long-term workplace strategy and saying, we're going to have people come in 3 days a week because it makes people more productive. And they're not having any data to back that up. And they're saying things like, oh, again, we were going to have people come in 2021, in September 2021, I'm back to the office full time. And that didn't happen. And so everyone knows that the emperor has no clothes, right? Everyone knows that. And again, you look at the sort of the bottom on the manager side here, right? 15% of managers aren't sure how companies informing post-pandemic decisions are planning, and that 70% of organizations, again, are not using actual data to drive these decisions. And so taken together, this means that not only are companies not actually able to say anything beyond sort of just an edict, right? But I think, and this gets to the fundamental issue. You look at a lot of organizations, and you might see this in a number of tech companies, right? Employees who are being very, very vocal about dissatisfaction with the workplace strategy of their organization. And the issue is that fundamentally, the company says, we think this strategy makes us more productive. And employees say, we disagree. And there's nowhere to go from there because it's all opinion-based. It's 100% opinion-based, right? And I know the folks at most of these technology companies who are driving these decisions. And by and large, again, they're made these decisions based on the opinions of a couple of executives and an employee survey around, again, how many people would quit. And that's it, right? Versus if they could say, all right, well, specifically, we're trying to have people back in the office because we are concerned that there is a lot less interaction between teams. Just for example, that's a really basic one, or that, we've seen weak ties degrade, and we'll talk about more of those in a second. You at least give folks a metric you can sort of see, oh, here's why they're making the decision. And then when we implement it, did it actually have the effect we wanted? Right? And again, it's not that it's going to make everybody happy, but reasonable people can see, all right, this is why they're making the decision. And I'm not even saying all these companies are making the wrong decision, but because they're not using data, because they're not able to transparently communicate it, it does, again, a number of things here. It reduces confidence in the workforce. You see folks who still aren't fully informed, about this plan, over half of employees, right? But then also, if you look at, on the manager side, the fact that, only, 20% haven't been included, 25% say only executive leadership influences these things. Again, using data, it doesn't totally solve these things, but at least says we are really taking into account the experience of everybody. And we're trying to make decisions that are right, but we're not sure if they're going to work, right? Because no one can be sure, but then we can iterate on them, right? And I think these are pretty important things, at least that I take away from this. Right. Moving to post-pandemic, because it's obviously, is something that we're getting close to entering right now, that a lot of people are open to returning to the office, but again, you say 37% don't want to return at all. I am really curious, does this mean 37% of people are going to quit if they're required to come back to the office full time? I don't think so, because this is sort of more preference, but it's still, this is quite high. Again, especially compared to pre-pandemic. And so this idea that we have created new habits during the pandemic, I think is, obviously a lot of us probably subjectively feel that, but it's certainly borne out in the data as well. And again, you see folks would speak to their manager if they were asked to return full time, but you do see 20% of folks would look for a new job, right? It is interesting because with this desire for flexibility, there still is, 40% of folks who actually would want a predetermined planned office schedule, right? So again, and this is actually matched by managers. You can see on the right that managers also almost at the same percentage want this plan. And I think that this is quite interesting because pre-pandemic, we still had manager discretion at the vast majority of companies. The default was people come into the office every day, but with manager discretion, essentially, right? And I think what we're doing now, which is probably quite healthy, is saying, all right, well, we're going to try to provide guidance for the whole company. But again, there's a lot of question of, do we say, well, folks come in 3 days a week, but we don't care what 3 days, which seems kind of weird because, at least to me, if the purpose of the office is to change how people collaborate, then what you're probably trying to do is get certain groups to communicate more when they're in the office at the same time. So if one group comes in 2 days a week and one group comes in 3 days a week, but at totally separate days, then, if they don't need to work with each other at all, maybe that's okay. But probably in a lot of cases, you'd want at least some overlap. Right? But without a predetermined schedule, it's going to be very hard to guarantee that. And so the idea is, it doesn't, I don't think, mean that manager discretion goes away, but at least for people to be able to plan their lives, but for organizations to still be able to achieve a lot of their collaboration goals, maybe also some financial goals in terms of reducing office space. This seems like something that is really a win-win for both employees and organizations. So hopefully this is something that more companies can take moving forward. All right. So I've spent a lot of time talking about sort of preferences, and now we're going to shift gears and talk about how have collaboration patterns actually changed during the pandemic. All right. And so I'll show you the results just to tell you again where this is from. So at Humanyze, again, we hook into metadata from these existing corporate systems to understand sort of collaboration and work patterns at very large scales. So again, we're deployed across millions of people. We have tens of billions of interaction data coming into our platform globally, right? So we not just from the US, but from I think over 150 countries, right? And so what I'm going to show you here is not what folks think is happening, but I want to show you how work is actually changing. And we're going to compare sort of pre-pandemic and then during the pandemic. Again, if folks have questions about other cuts, we certainly have cuts from, I don't feel extremely confident yet talking about different regions and what you've seen in places like Asia versus the US. Like we do have an awful lot of data from them, but from different regions, but and so I can offer some insight, but I'm just cautious about saying things other than more globally, right? And so here's what we see. Okay. When people started working remotely, there was an over 16% increase in collaboration with sort of these strong ties, closest teammates, right? And the way we define this, and it's robust to definition, essentially what you're doing is you're looking at who do folks interact with so the equivalent of an hour more in one-on-one communication, right? So it could be you and I have, every week we have a 1 hour one-on-one meeting. It could be we're in four-person 1 hour meetings. I mean, essentially these are people on the same teams, right? And this has gone up again, 16%, so it's quite significant. And this was really interesting to me. Again, first of all, I think it makes sense in hindsight, because people start to work remotely. You need to proactively schedule meetings with folks that you need to talk to do your job. And so this is where it comes out there. At the same time, I do want to emphasize that pretty much every even cuts of data that we did pre-pandemic, meta-analyses of remote work pre-pandemic, all said that communication should drop between coworkers when folks work remotely. And I think they're probably, the fact that everyone was working remotely at the same time, obviously, I think played a huge factor here. But this is quite unexpected, at least for my money, and it's probably a good thing. Like, you probably need this kind of interaction. And you also saw this interaction of 11% with sort of colleagues of we call them secondary connections. And these are people you interact with 15 minutes to an hour, the equivalent of that in one-on-one communication. Again, so folks who are still somewhat related to your work, probably, right? There's still more of an sort of increase in that, right? There's also this really interesting increase, and this was quite surprising to me, a 27% increase in communication between different levels of the hierarchy. Again, that's a lot. And this is, I think, it's probably the most positive thing that at least I could point to that's come from remote work, is this, really breaking down of traditional barriers to for folks to reach out to folks that they need to do their job. Probably the way that I would describe this, or maybe explain this, is that when you're in the office, typically the executives are on a separate floor from everybody else. They might have private offices. There are lots of signals saying that you shouldn't be here and you shouldn't talk to these people. Whereas if you're working on Slack, if you're working on Teams, there's no barriers, right? And so people seem to be much more comfortable reaching out, to folks, either above them or below them in the hierarchy. And I think this is a extremely positive impact of remote work, and something, again, thinking about remote work as a tool, right? If this is an issue, again, if the organization is extremely hierarchical and there's not enough, visibility on the front lines for folks higher up, it certainly seems like using remote work as a tool in the toolbox would be quite prudent. Right? Now, the flip side, and this is the last point here, there's been this 21% decrease in communication with weak ties. So these are weak connections. Again, these are people who are, 5 to 15 minutes a week. And you might say, well, this shouldn't matter. These are people who you don't really need to talk to do your job. The thing is that if you look at innovation, if you look at milestone attainment in large projects, these ties are the biggest predictor of those things, right? Because these are people, again, in terms of new ideas, these are people who are not in your immediate social group. They haven't drunk the Kool-Aid on whatever your project is. And so talking to people like that is extremely important. In a similar way, when you look at milestone attainment on large projects, it's not to say that strong ties aren't important, but a great example that I like to think about actually in this area, and there's been lots of research on this and great pieces. I'm happy to share links if folks are interested on things in the aerospace industry in particular, right? That you think about airplane development, very complex machines with lots of dependencies, and essentially there's been a lot of work showing that if my work depends on your work, right, or my code depends on your code, or my widget depends on your widget, and we don't communicate, that's where the bugs pop up. It's 32% longer to develop code, for example, if we don't have that communication, right? And so what you see in large projects is it's not the major dependencies that get overlooked, right? Of course, on the critical systems, on the things that everyone knows have to work together, you have lots of meetings, lots of communication to make sure those parts work well. But what fails are these peripheral systems where different groups are working on different parts of the system that only loosely interact, but it's enough where if there's absolutely no communication in these areas, then there's going to be a real issue, right? And that's what these ties are good for, right? Beyond innovation, just again on milestone attainment. This gets back again to the video game industry example I talked about earlier, where the hypothesis is that the drop in these ties is the reason that video game development has been, despite being financially in an amazing position, the reason that it's likely been lagging is a reduction in these ties. And actually in the piece, we point out even just some subjective quotes from folks in the industry about this being an issue. And again, the other issue there is that because the video game industry has financially been doing so well, right? The fact that if even them can't get this right and can't improve that, then this implies this is going to be a very large problem for remote work moving forward, right? And again, I think what I would take away from all these results, again, most clearly, is that workplace is the tool, it's a management tool. It changes how people work, right? And this is how it's likely to change how folks work, right? And I saw a question in the chat that I just want to maybe call out here. It's hard for us to talk about quality of this communication, right? Like we don't know. So, which valid point is that, okay, is there higher quality of, for example, face-to-face communication? Does that create different things in terms of relationships compared to email or chat? And the answer is it does, right? And there is a lot of information on that. At the same time, there actually has been a lot more work recently during the pandemic on things like the importance of sort of how do changes in video setup also change relationships. And so there are a lot of, there are ways to communicate in sort of equivalently remotely as we do in person. At the same time, what I would say is what this data is trying to show is, like, if you had to put money down and you just had to bet, I don't know anything else about the organization, right, or about these teams, but this team is going to work remotely. What is likely to happen? This is what's likely to happen, right? It's not saying it's impossible. Again, you can communicate with anybody when you work remotely. Like you can, or probably even in person you can, not just for folks who are there face to face, but you can still email people, of course, when you're in the office. But again, what you see is very consistently, and there are exceptions in our data, right? Like there are, of course, some teams that did see an increase in weak ties. Like it does happen. It is possible. It is just very, very unlikely to happen, right? And I mean, there's other things that, of course, happen as well. And again, I sort of alluded to this result earlier, but what we see in the data as well is that work days are significantly longer for folks, which I think probably most of us have experienced. This is not shocking. And again, what I want to say, it's not people are working more. It's spread out across most of the day. Again, the amount of time people are spending working, which again, we're calculating from looking at the usage of these different, corporate systems. That's almost identical to pre-pandemic. The issue with this here, and again, one reason is you're just getting interrupted more by other demands you have on your time when you're working remotely, or when, again, even during a pandemic, of course, is another issue with this. But, another way to think about this, right, is that this probably is going to significantly slow down the speed of decision-making within organizations. And maybe let me explain that a little bit more. So pre-pandemic, you could have assumed that most people, let's say between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., most people will be on those hours. And so if you need to schedule a meeting, you could probably get everybody, during that time. Well, now, if you're trying to get 4 people together for a meeting, well, this person, they're out from 1 to 2, and this person's out from 2 to 3. And it's going to take you slightly longer to have those conversations, to reply to those messages. And it's understandable, right? It's not like people are doing something wrong, but that is a drag on the business, right? And that's beyond the stress concerns that you should have from this, right? That is a real concern I have, at least from a productivity perspective of the organization, not of the individual, not of like, are people working? Because people are working. Or the way we're collaborating, is that actually effective? Now, you do see this really nice actually decrease of work happening on the weekends. So the days are longer, but at least folks aren't working as much on the weekends. So it does appear like people have been developing strategies to be able to, and again, this has changed actually really early on in the pandemic. This did go up a little bit, right? So it does seem like people have done a pretty good job figuring out how to at least box their time during the week. And again, I wouldn't have actually expected this. It was pretty significant here. couple of things just to point out, like, it is fascinating to me that over a quarter of people actually have fewer one-on-one meetings than they did pre-pandemic, right? And this is concerning because if there's something that actually you would hope would happen remotely, it is one-on-one meetings, right? I mean, I know how many people we got in this Zoom call, like, 40 some, not to say that those large Zoom calls are always bad, but they're generally not the most effective way to make decisions, at least, right? And the fact that you see fewer of these one-on-one meetings, which are critical for building relationships, right? That is quite concerning. And the fact that you see, again, 36% of folks having these more of these longer meetings, like 80 minutes or longer. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I don't think, my experience of the pandemic has been, hey, you know what I really love? These super long Zoom meetings. Like, that is just the most engaging thing ever. But yet I guess this is actually happening. And again, we see this in the data. This is happening for a pretty significant number of people. And that's really concerning. Like, I've heard other takes on this, that maybe what this implies is that teams are trying to batch meetings together so that folks don't have to have multiple meetings about the same topic. I'm somewhat skeptical of that, just because a lot of the data, or these sort of experiments and sort of research, both during the pandemic as well as pre-pandemic, really indicates that as these meetings increase in length, people actually are less engaged. They tend to pay less attention. Also, one thing we see in our data, interestingly, is this is not shocking, as meeting gets longer, people multitask more, which is not, I'm sure none of you all are multitasking this very engaging presentation, but other people do that. It's something that some other folks do, and so again, you just have to ask yourself, and this is maybe something you could even do yourself, right? Certainly, actually, our customers have actually used our analytics to try to cut this down in terms of being able to say, all right, we actually want fewer of these long meetings. But when you create a meeting invite, I mean, I think this is one of the challenges. There's the cost for you for adding someone to a meeting or adding 30 minutes to a meeting is zero, right? Like, you drag the box longer, it's no problem. But of course, that's time, right? It's people's time. There's a real cost. And I think trying to make that salient to folks, and also, for us as individuals, even thinking about, do we really need to do this? I think being a lot more intentional about these meetings is going to be quite important, right? And again, you see, a similar thing here, 31% have more large meetings with less, 10 or more people. Again, these are generally considered to be extremely ineffective for anything other than just information dissemination, which, if we're being honest, in terms of a percentage of the work that we do, especially in large organizations or information work, it's just not that much. Like, this should be going down, honestly. And again, another concerning thing is 26% of folks had less focus time. And the way we're calculating that is looking at sort of blocks of time, 15 minutes or more, that are uninterrupted. Now, I can't guarantee that people are doing focused work during that time, but that's sort of like the upper limit on what they could possibly be doing for focused work. And again, the reason you look at 15 minutes is there's decades of research that if you have less than 15 minutes of uninterrupted time, you're just a lot less effective than when it's more than that, right? And so when it comes down to actually getting heads down work done, which of course needs to happen in a lot of work, for a lot of the organization, this is, again, another concerning thing, right? And so it's not universal. It's not that this happens to everybody, but certainly you see large parts of organizations where this does occur. And again, thinking about, how is remote work a tool? Well, when do you want some of these things to happen, or when do you not want them to happen? This just, again, these workplace decisions make these things more likely or less likely. Right? And maybe to wrap up, because I know we're coming up on time. So, it's sort of some general points, right? And I've said this a couple times throughout the discussion, but just to emphasize it, that when it comes to making, I'd say, people decisions in general, but obviously we've been talking about, workplace decisions specifically here, there's a lot of data that I think needs to be brought to bear on those decisions. Like, sentiment is important. And I think that is something that companies have been using now for a while and are quite comfortable using it. And I think that's a good thing. At the same time, I would argue that so hard behavioral data on how people work from these different systems that you see on the right that we already have. Like we already have email systems, we have Zoom, we even have location systems within offices to give us some insight into that face-to-face interaction, right? But that actually gives us information about how work is actually happening, not just perception, which does again matter, but how's work happening? Does that match with our strategy? Is this going to cause performance challenges? But then we can also, again, be very transparent about what are we trying to achieve with any people decision. We're trying to, increase the number of weak ties. Does that happen? And if it doesn't, okay, we're going to try something else. And if it does, great, let's roll that out more broadly. But again, being able to look at things in the right way, I think is really important. And then beyond that, what again has been extremely clear, I mean, we'll use the workplace as an example. I think in the past, this was, much more of a decision driven, primarily, for example, by corporate real estate. But of course, the work environment you have, is influenced by, the HR policies you have, the processes you have, the tools you have to collaborate. So the idea of, real estate, HR, IT working together with these other stakeholders to actually make these decisions, I think is the right way to do things. I have been very encouraged by seeing an increasing number of companies, have sort of people groups where these different supporting functions actually report up to the same person, typically chief people officer, although it changes in other cases. But I do think, at least for the strategic decisions of these, not the administrative decisions, right? If you look at, corporate real estate in terms of, facilities management, if you look at HR in terms of dispute resolution, IT in terms of just, tech support, right? I think those are administrative and they're not strategic. They're still important. Like, I don't mean to downplay them, right? But that those can be made in their own functions. But ideally, you take the strategic functions, the strategic parts of each of those functions, and you put those into a new part of the organization, right? That actually has the decision-making authority to, again, to really drive strategy. And I think to be able to make decisions in this much more inclusive way. But that, to wrap up, the idea here is that this is never done, right? You're never going to come up with, even if you are able to find, for example, an optimal workplace strategy, let's say, right now, you can say, if we implement this thing, everyone's going to be more productive. Well, that's not going to be the case probably in a quarter, if we're being honest, right? Like, it'll change because the work you do changes, because society changes. And so with the market demands change, all these things change. And so the idea that what we can do with this approach, both from a data as well as, sort of a multidisciplinary perspective, is we can iterate on these strategies. We can test new things. We can use this data to see, are we achieving what we want? And we can keep repeating this process so that we can keep finding and keep challenging our assumptions on what's actually going to make us effective as an organization. We can keep evolving and keep going much faster than we could previously. Right? I think what's very exciting is that, if you think about how slow we were, pre-pandemic to change workplace strategy, right? Like, what did you do? Move to a new office every 10 years. Right? Well, of course, your work changes much faster, than every 10 years, right? I mean, every quarter, maybe you could argue every year, these things are changing. But the fact that the way we work wouldn't change that quickly was a real issue. And being able to move much more quickly, being able to iterate much more quickly to improve how we collaborate. Like, I think this is really one of the opportunities that we see coming out of the pandemic. And that I hope we're able to grab onto. And again, I think that what we see in even the sentiment data, this fact that, for example, people want scheduled days. They didn't even necessarily say that those scheduled days could change, right? That if, like, for a particular quarter, we should come in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but that maybe it actually looks like we're not achieving what we want. So next quarter we could do, Tuesday, Thursday, right? Like, those are possible. Right? But that, again, I think without data, it's much harder to justify those decisions. But what we've seen, what people have demonstrated through the pandemic, is just how resilient they are, how able they are to make changes that we would have thought, would take a 6-month change management exercise to get people to work remotely. But no, we didn't need that. We needed like 2 weeks, right? And so we should use that. We can use that to, again, much faster, much more quickly change how we work and how we collaborate to be a lot more effective as organizations. So I think that is very exciting moving forward. So again, we've got a future work report that goes into some of this in more detail. You can look more at that. Happy to take questions now, and also just thanks folks for their time. So maybe with that, we'll see if folks have questions, feel free to ask in the chat. And I already see some coming in, but then also we'll do some hand raising later. So see a question from Richard. Are there benchmark data patterns from an aggregate of organizations that individual organizations can examine? So yeah, Richard, I very intentionally didn't talk about our product, but that is like essentially what our product, a big part of what our product does. So this is what has been very interesting. I mean, again, even for me, because when I was doing this for my PhD research, right, like we just struggled to get data from 300 people from an organization at first, and now we have data. I mean, I have data coming in from, a number of Fortune, even 50 companies where they have hundreds of thousands of employees globally. And so what it means is that we now have this representative data set of how work happens. And so when we talk about things like weak ties, I actually know what that distribution looks like for all employees. And so what's interesting there is being able to say, for a particular team, something really concerning is going on here. And that's what I'd say with benchmarks with behavioral data in particular, at least my view on it, is what they're good at. Like ideally what you should do is correlate these kind of metrics to the KPIs you have in the business to say, a 5% change in this behavior leads to a Y% change in, something you care about. But even without that, because we now have this global, globally representative data set, which to be fair, changes now, month to month, like work is changing much faster than it was pre-pandemic. But still what these things can say out of the box is, I don't know what this team does, but something almost certainly bad is happening here. Like an easy example to understand is imagine, so manager visibility is one thing we measure, right? It's how much time do managers spend with teams. And so imagine if you look at one division, an entire division, and you see managers that are spending less than 2% of their time with their team. Right? Like, I don't care what work they do. That's super concerning, right? And a lot of times, let's say, most of the time, these are things the wider organization was not aware was happening, right? And so you make that visible. And again, normally like a third of the time, there's some contextual explanation for why that's happening, right? The product is on fire and the teams are trying to meet to figure out what to do. Okay, understandable. But 2/3 of the time, these are things that just actually need to be fixed. And that's really what those, I'd say, benchmarks are actually really good at, is sort of identifying where in the organization and what specific behaviors are likely to be an issue. And then that's where, again, yes, you also use things like interviews or surveys to figure out, okay, well, what do we do about this? Like, what is the issue here? So yeah, I think that's certainly something that, and I guess we're going to talk about that more in a couple of weeks, where we can look at our site. But yes, that is sort of how we've developed things as well. Thanks for the question there. Any other questions or comments?
Hey, Ben, John here. Maybe you've said this and I missed it, but what do you think the biggest challenge ahead will be for organizations shifting to hybrid work versus those planning to return fully to the office? So your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think that hybrid work is this term where I feel like no one knows what it means, right? Like it's basically this very wide spectrum in between no one ever comes into the office and people always come in, right? And it's in between there. And I think that I think one of the biggest challenges is that I see a lot of organizations, they're going to have a hybrid work strategy, but it's still going to be pretty uniform across the organization, right? Like everybody's going to come in 3 days a week. And I think that doesn't make sense. And people, I think employees are rightly going to call that out, right? In that, but again, I think the issue is that individuals are making assumptions without seeing this macro perspective, right? Because certainly for some teams in an organization, like if you're a Fortune 500 company, it is so unlikely that every single employee in the organization would need to work in the exact same way, right? Like that, it's impossible. Like that's not going to happen. There's certainly some teams where 3 days a week will make sense. There's some teams where 4 days a week will make sense. Some teams where no days a week make sense, right? And so I think that ideally this is something that is done, much more like there can be general guidance, but then within that guidance, different parts of the organization, different teams do different things. I think if we're being honest, like the reason a lot of organizations aren't doing those things is because it takes more effort, right? Like it's harder to do things that are more, that are a lot more customized, that are a lot a lot more focus for different parts of the company. The issue, of course, is that by taking a one-size-fits-all approach, you're going to make an awful lot of mistakes. And again, as we saw, even in the sentiment data, you're going to tick off a lot of people, probably more than you would, even if you did, something that had more discretion baked in, right? And so I hope that hybrid means some amount of discretion, but also some iteration over time. I think that companies that don't take that approach are going to find it actually I think a lot of them are trying to just say, we're just trying to do something where people aren't going to come in as much so that we make them happier. But I don't think they're thinking about the workplace again strategically as a tool to change how people work. Right? And again, because they're not using data, they can't communicate that to the employees. And so I think that's really what I would like folks to look at moving forward. Obviously, I'm like somewhat biased on this point, but I do really believe this, right? I think that that's going to be like a very big challenge, for folks, because in trying to not upset anybody, they're probably going to end up upsetting everyone. And also making decisions that probably aren't even best for the performance of the organization, right? Which is what, all these things that we care about, but that's obviously one that has to happen too.
Thanks, Ben.
Anyone else have any questions? Do you just want to speak up? Everyone's really quiet today.
All right. Well, I must have just answered all the questions, so it's all right. But no, definitely really appreciated the conversation, folks. And again, we got some, if you have a question, feel free to shoot us an email. Check out our site, and no, I really appreciate the time today.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you and Humanyze and sharing all of your research. It's amazing what you guys have been able to gather. And it's so current. It's exactly what people need. So thank you so much. And if any of you want to learn more about Humanyze, they're going to speak at our ESA Work Tech Startup Advisors discussion. They will be, they'll talk for about 15 minutes with 10 minutes of Q&A. If any of you have ever attended those, it's very fast paced. There will be another startup called Prosper that will speak the second half of that hour. And that is on December the 14th. So watch for invitations and be sure to join us. So as I said before, we're going to send out the recording of this and the presentation as soon as Zoom gets me all the stuff. And we really appreciate you guys dialing in and all of your support, and look forward to the next time we see you, which should be soon. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Ben. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.